Hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining our session today. Where are we on the path to an open future? This session will be led by Jess Monaghan, who is Head of Policy and Performance in Springer Nature's Open Access team. So Jess started working for Springer Nature back in 2014 after completing her PhD in history. But her current focus is now on developing Springer Nature's OA policies and strategy to help drive the transition to open research. So for this first session today, Jess will be looking at how Springer Nature is moving towards and driving an open future, with a particular focus on the impact and development around transformative journals and transformative agreements. We will be leaving time for a Q&A session at the end, so please do post any questions you have during the session into the chat box, and we will address them at the close of the presentation. Thank you very much, and Jess, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Katie. So I'd like to start this session with a poll, as I know that Frankfurt Book Fair can have quite a diverse audience, and I think particularly being online this year, we obviously could have a whole range of different people with us. And what I'd like to understand is just a little bit more about your levels of familiarity with the topic of open research and open access. So please could we launch the poll now? And hopefully over the next minute or so, you will be able to see the poll pop up in the GoToWebinar menu, which you'll be able to answer. So what we're going to be asking is, how familiar are you with open access publishing and open research? And you can choose your option down from very familiar, somewhat familiar, right down to I've never heard of this before, and then that will hopefully give us a sense of what sort of a mix of different audience members we have today. While you have a minute or two to respond, I'll give a quick overview of what we're going to be covering in today's session. We're going to start out with an introduction to Springer Nature and to our commitment to open research, before moving on to discussing what we mean by gold open access and why this is crucial for enabling immediate access to the published version of record of research outputs. From there, I'm going to be giving some insight into transformative agreements, which Springer Nature has successfully pioneered and has been a very important method for enabling open access at scale. And then we'll take a look at our newest model for supporting open access, which is transformative journals. Once we've covered those topics, we'll talk briefly about some of the challenges that publishers, but also the other stakeholders within publishing and within research are facing when we're looking at this transition towards open research. And having covered those topics, we'll think about what it is that we can do in terms of innovation and collaboration to enable open access, and looking beyond open access itself to broadening up open research to all different types of outputs and what that future might look like. So hopefully you've all now had a chance to complete the poll. So if we could close that now and show the results on the screen. I'm not actually able to see the results of the poll myself. Let me just check how we do that.
Jess, I can run through it quickly for you.
Oh, that would be great,
Okay.
Thank you.
So we have 38% who are saying very familiar, 31% who are saying familiar, 24% who are somewhat familiar, and 7% who are unfamiliar. And thankfully, 0% have never heard of it before.
Great, thanks, Katie. Obviously need to brush up on my GoToWebinar skills a bit more. But that's great that we have quite a number of you today on the webinar who are already at least somewhat familiar with open access and open research. I hope that means that you'll be really interested to learn more about what we're doing in terms of supporting and progressing this area. And also for those of you who are less familiar, this should be a really good introduction to some of the benefits of open research and what we can look at to do to help support that. So I'll now move on to looking at our commitment to open research and thinking about what it is that this means for Springer Nature. In terms of our mission, at Springer Nature, we're aiming to help researchers advance discovery by making their findings as accessible, understandable, discoverable, usable, reusable, and shareable as possible. And the reason that I'm reading out our mission to you is because I think this is really important in terms of helping you to understand why we think opening up access to research is the way to help advance discovery. By making sure that all researchers, and in fact everyone in the world who has access to an internet connection, is able to read the research that's being published, we believe that we can deliver this mission and make sure that the content is being used in the most effective way possible. We believe that opening up research benefits the whole research community and the world more broadly, because as well as ensuring that researchers have immediate access to content without having to deal with paywalls, true open research can also help facilitate collaboration between researchers. It can support the application of research to real-world problems, so for example, the Sustainable Development Goals. It can help foster economic growth. It can enable greater reproducibility of research, and it can avoid the duplication of effort that might happen if there isn't this awareness of what other research is being conducted. And I think it's also really helpful in terms of increasing the public's trust and appreciation of research. Also, for the perspective of researchers, it also has great benefits for them individually. We've seen in the analysis that we've done of our own open access articles versus those that are by subscription access, that researchers find that their work is more widely read and reused, so that can be really helpful for their own profile as well. A key part of our commitment to open research is ensuring that we offer researchers options to make their work openly accessible across our portfolio. So you might be familiar with some of our different imprints that we publish within Springer Nature, from Nature Research to Springer, BMC and Palgrave Macmillan. And we're offering authors across different imprints the ability to make their research openly accessible, including in books, and also by encouraging the sharing of research data. As a result, we have the world's most significant open access portfolio. Last year, we were really proud to say that we published more primary research articles by the open access route than any other research publisher. Authors who want to open up their research can publish open access in our more than 600 open access journals. So these are our fully open access journals where all content is available open access. We also have a portfolio of over 2,000 hybrid open access journals, which offer a combination of a choice for authors of publishing via the subscription route or via the Gold Open Access route. We published over 100,000 articles via the open access route in 2019 alone. And we have various services for our journals and policies that help support researchers in opening up their underlying research data. It's not just in journals and articles that we're developing open access. We've also published more than 1,000 open access books to date, which is a fantastic milestone. So now that you know a little bit more about our track record at Springer Nature in terms of opening up research, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to dig a bit deeper into the importance of how we enable open access to publications. So talking a bit more about Gold Open Access. At Springer Nature, we firmly support Gold Open Access as the path to an open feature. Some of you might be familiar with the different labels or colours that are used when talking about open access, and for others that might be a bit less familiar. Well, we believe that an effective open research ecosystem requires open access for the final, trusted and maintained version of record, and this is known as Gold Open Access. With this approach, the version of record is open to anyone, and it can be connected up to all the other open research outputs that are generated as part of the research process. So you can see here on the screen, and we have a range of these different possible outputs in this network of open research. And these might include, on the left-hand side, open data, which enables researchers to see the sources that are underlying the work that's showcased in the paper, to peer review reports that allow researchers to understand how the paper has been assessed and improved by the input of researchers and editors, to things such as open citations that tell us more about the work that this article is building on, and also the other articles, the ways in which other articles are building on the article itself. The alternative that's been proposed by some in terms of an open access world is to pursue green open access, which is a route that we believe at Springer Nature can never deliver the true benefits of open research. Green open access means sharing earlier manuscript versions of the article in internet repositories, and we think this risks confusing the scholarly record, and it doesn't deliver this image, this vision that we have of an easily navigable and a well-connected open research ecosystem, which we want to create through Gold Open Access. With green open access deposition, for example, there might be multiple different versions of manuscripts that have been deposited in different repositories by authors of the paper, which are typically less easily discoverable, less usable, and less well connected to the open research outputs. I think a key point to remember as well is that supporting green open access archiving prevents funding from being moved from subscription access towards supporting gold open access for the trusted and maintained version of record. I think it can be quite a common misconception or a viewpoint that green open access is somehow free or low cost. But I think we really need to remember that a lot of effort and resource goes into developing from the submitted manuscript to refine this to the accepted version that's usually deposited in repositories. And with green open access, the costs of the infrastructure, the staff, all of the services from peer review to ethics checks and other improvements that occur prior to acceptance, these still need to be covered somehow, which is usually by maintaining subscriptions to journals. And this then means that those subscription funds are tied up in delivering an inferior form of open access, when instead we should be focusing on delivering open access to the trusted version of record and ensuring that our funds are focused on that. So as a result, we believe gold open access offers the most open and sustainable route to open access and to open research. But how are we achieving this? We'll start with taking a look at transformative agreements. What is a transformative agreement? I borrowed here a very useful definition from Lisa Hinchcliffe, which she used in an article in the Scholarly Kitchen blog. Skipping ahead there. At its most fundamental, a contract can be viewed as being a transformative agreement if it's seeking to shift the payments that a library or a group of libraries are making to publishers away from being focused on subscription-based reading and towards open access publication. This shift from subscription reading towards open access publishing is why transformative agreements are sometimes described as read and publish deals, or as publish and read agreements. There's lots of different terminology that's sometimes used for this. And at Springer Nature, our transformative agreements are also known as compact agreements. By bringing together these two elements of reading and publishing, these types of agreements can enable institutions to shift their own publication outputs towards gold open access and transition the funds that they're currently spending on subscriptions to this purpose. It's also really helpful for authors, as it means that they don't need to worry about finding funding to pay for individual open access publishing services via what's known as an article processing charge, because the costs are being billed centrally to their institution. At Springer Nature, we were the first to pioneer this new business model of transformative agreements, announcing our compact agreement with the Netherlands in 2014, and having launched a range of different agreements with other consortia since then. So we now have 11 national transformative agreements in place, which is the most of any publisher. Next year, we kick off our transformative agreement with the University of California system, and that's the biggest agreement in the US to date, so a really fantastic milestone there as well. As well as making it easy for individual authors to publish their work via the open access route, one of the most exciting things about transformative agreements that we're seeing is that they're really enabling open access at scale. So being the first to have developed transformative agreements, at Springer Nature, we now have the evidence to be able to demonstrate their success. Recently, we analysed publications in journals across our portfolios for the 8 countries where we had a national transformative agreement live last year. And we found that the viewpoint was really positive. So for all of these countries, between 70 and 90% of the articles that we published were gold open access. And I think this is really clear evidence that where national consortia can collaborate with publishers to transition their funds from subscriptions to open access, we're able to achieve real country level flips of their publications to immediate open access. So you might be asking at this stage, what are we doing for those countries that aren't able at this stage to have a transformative agreement? And that's where our new model of transformative journals comes in. So what is a transformative journal? I think at its simplest, a transformative journal, or a TJ as we sometimes call them, can be defined as a formerly subscription or hybrid journal that's now committed to transitioning to become a fully open access journal. This idea of transformative journals that are committed to an open access transition is one that Springer Nature proposed back in May of 2019. In our discussions with the Coalition S group of funders who are committed to an immediate open access transition, and also in conversations with others in the research community, what we realised is that there was a real need to enable authors to continue to publish in the journals of their choice which might at this stage not yet be fully open access or able to immediately flip to open access. So enabling them to continue to publish in those journals whilst also supporting those titles to actively transition to open access. So we've now committed the majority of our non-open access titles to this TJ path starting in January of next year. As Stephen Inchcombe, our Chief Publishing and Solutions Officer, noted when we announced our TJ commitment, we're really pleased that Plan S funders have welcomed TJs as a compliant publication option for their authors, as we're really going to need the support of research funders and institutions, as well as researchers, in order to achieve transition for our TJs. What does this mean then for authors who are publishing in these journals that have transformative journal status? They'll be able to choose between gold open access publication and the subscription publication route, so they still have this choice, and they can make that decision based on their preferences, on their funder and institutional open access policies, and also on the availability of funding for open access publication. But where TJs are different is that they'll be taking a much more active role in encouraging open access uptake. So in terms of the commitments that transformative journals make, in addition to committing to an annual open access growth and a transition to full open access for primary research once 75% of their content is being published open access, what TJs will be doing is actively promoting the benefits of open access to authors and making use of open metrics and open reporting to showcase what we've already found when we've analysed open access publications and subscription publications. So showing this greater usage, the citations, the attention that these articles receive, and really encouraging authors to consider this route as one that's beneficial not only for the research community, but also for their own research. And we'll also be encouraging institutional and funder support through these metrics and through transparent pricing. In this way, I think transformative journals form a key part of our strategy for transition to open research as part of our Transformative Publishing programme. As you've seen from some of the statistics that I was talking about earlier in relation to transformative agreements, these TAs have already set us on the path to open access transition in countries where we have these agreements, national consortia. And now with our transformative journals, we're going to be promoting open access and supporting open access growth for authors who aren't yet covered by transformative agreements. Importantly, gold open access publication in TJs will be a compliant publication route for authors whose Plan S funders might require that they make their work immediately openly accessible. So those authors will still be able to publish in the Springer Nature journals of their choice, and they'll know that these titles are on the pathway to full open access. Now, we've focused so far on the approaches for facilitating open access transition, but as I'm sure many of you, those particularly who are familiar and who work with open access and open research, there are still quite a lot of challenges that we as publishers and all of the other stakeholders within research are facing when we're looking at transitioning. I'm going to focus on two of these challenges today, which Springer Nature has been particularly interested in exploring over the last couple of years. And this includes the complexity of funding streams that need to be transitioned to support open access publishing, and also the variation of approaches that we see regionally and around the world in terms of attitudes and approaches and speeds of transition for open access. I won't try and talk you through these very tiny little pictures that I've added on this slide here. It's more just to give you a sense of some of the numbers and the research that's out there. We have our APCs in the Wild white paper published earlier this year on complexity of funding streams, which I'm just about to show you a couple of graphs from. And obviously those who are familiar with things such as directories of policies will know that there is quite a difference between the level of open access engagement and policy in some areas of the world, such as Europe, compared with others. So to OA funding streams. This is an area which at Springer Nature we've been interested in exploring in quite some detail. And at the beginning of this year, our white paper was published, which explained the findings of some research that we did into the open access funding sources of researchers publishing with us. So we surveyed authors who'd recently published via the gold open access route in one of our fully open access or hybrid open access journals. And we asked them, what source of funding have you used to cover the article processing charges or the APC that's charged for open access publishing services, and had a look at how those results kind of split out into different types of funding. So what we found was that over a quarter of authors use entirely wild APC funding sources, And what we mean by wild APC funding sources are those types of funds that aren't really easily visible to institutions or to research funders. So for example, perhaps instead of using a dedicated institutional open access fund or dedicated open access funds from their research funders, these researchers might have used their research grants to pay APCs, or might have made use of ad hoc institutional budgets for open access that anyone looking at open access within the institution might not be aware of having been used in this way. And I think what this means for institutions who are thinking about transitioning to open access is that it can be quite difficult for them to understand what are the potential different funding sources that they could draw on in order to be able to centralise open access funding for their authors and to be able to streamline the processes for everyone through an open access agreement. We were also interested to see how this picture varied regionally. And we found, as you might expect, that it becomes even more complicated because with the different policies and the different approaches that have been taken, there is a different picture when it comes to the types of funding that authors are using around the world. So if we look at the UK, for example, which in this graph is third from the bottom, there we can see that only 13% of authors were using entirely wild APC funding sources. Whereas if we contrast that with North America, which is just above, we have 35% of authors that are using wild APC funds. And I think this really reflects the differences that there have been in terms of approaches to open access funding in these different countries. So what can we do about this? What are we working on in terms of innovation and new approaches to try to help handle some of the complexities of APC funding streams and regional variation? We're very aware of these challenges, so we've been working with institutions, and I'm just going to be giving a couple of examples of the ways that transformative agreements have been able to help with supporting of bringing together different funding streams at scale. So our agreements offer opportunities for institutions to examine funding streams and potentially bring together funding from both institutions, but also from the research funders that might already be funding APCs for the authors at these particular institutions. An early example of this was actually our agreement in the UK with the GIST consortia, where consortia members are contributing their own funds to support open access transition, but they've also been able to draw on one of the features of the open access landscape in the UK, which is the block grant funds for open access that research funders make available to institutions. So our agreement there draws upon funds via the institutions, but that come from the UKRI, and also from the Charity Open Access Fund, of which the Wellcome Trust is a key member. More recently than that, we're also experimenting with other approaches to transformative agreements to support the different funding structures that might exist elsewhere in the world. So as we saw in the APCs in the wild white paper graphs that we were just looking at, a much higher proportion of US authors are drawing on wild APC funding. And this is because US funders typically don't have dedicated pots of funds for open access in the same way that, for example, the UK does. But actually what this results in is that researchers are commonly drawing on and are often encouraged and permitted to do this by research funders. They're drawing on their main research grants to fund the costs of publication as part of the wider project for their research. And our new agreement with the University of California system really reflects this funding landscape, as rather than requiring the institutions to seek out and obtain direct funding contributions from research funders, it's employing a multi-payer model in order to enable this combination of funds. So the way that this works, as you can see here on the slide, is that the institution covers the first $1,000 per article, and then research funders can contribute indirectly by authors contributing the balance of the cost from research grants where that's available. If it's not available, then the University of California covers the remainder of the APC. And in this way, we're working with the University of California to support open access for their authors, but also ensuring that the costs of this transition can be shared among the different stakeholders who are in fact already contributing to funding open access publication, but might not be aware or might not have visibility on that contribution. So we will continue to engage with our partners among institutions and funders to develop models that can enable this transition to an open access and an open research future. But at the same time, we're also thinking ahead and aiming for the wider goal of open research. As I put here on the slide, there is obviously a lot more to open research than open access. I spent quite a lot of time in this presentation today focusing on open access publication because we think it's critical that we have access to the published version of record of research as part of this wider network of open research outputs. But in fact, we're already working in a range of different areas to support researchers in opening up their research outputs. So starting with our services in the areas of research data, we offer optional data deposition and curation services that can help researchers to ensure that their data is openly accessible, that it's easily reusable. We also have journal open data policies that encourage prompt researchers to think about opening up their data and including data availability statements alongside their published articles so that other researchers know where to go to find the research data. And another area where we've been making real progress, which is quite an exciting area of development, is in supporting the early sharing of submitted manuscripts of preprints. And this is through our collaboration with Research Square on the InReview platform, which has been integrated with a number of our titles, and a growing number of titles are making use of that. Finally, I wanted to quickly touch upon the work that we've done for a number of years in terms of peer review, with open or transparent peer review, where authors can opt to have their peer review reports released openly alongside the published article. So this means that other researchers can see the comments that their peers have made during the research process and how the manuscript has evolved. And as actually was commented, I think last week in a blog post as part of all of the discussions around trust in peer review, we think this is really important in helping to support trust in the peer review process, and I think is a key element of that. So this brings me then to the end of my presentation. As Katie said at the start, we would definitely welcome your questions and comments. So I'm looking forward to some time for a Q&A now. But I think if there's one thing that we can take away from what we've been discussing in this presentation today, and what at Springer Nature we've learned from the transition to open access so far, is that this process can really only be successful if it has the support of all the different stakeholders that are involved in the research and scholarly communications process. I think also that we can definitely take heart in that we've made huge progress where we do have this commitment. Thank you very much, all of you, for your time and attention. And please do drop your questions into the question box, and Katie and I will be happy to take those now.
Thank you very much, Jess, and I hope you all found that enjoyable and informative. And as Jess said, we've now got about 15-20 minutes for a Q&A session. Jess, we've already got some questions in, so I'm just going to go through them with you now. The first one of which you have answered really on your last slide, but I'm just going to repeat it for benefit of everyone else as well. So one of the attendees today has asked, in order to make this transition story successful, what support does Springer Nature and the rest of the publishing industry need to be able to do that? What does that success look like?
Absolutely, yeah. I think when it comes to transitioning to open access, it's not enough for us just to supply venues that authors can use to publish their work open access, which we already obviously do have with our fully open access and our hybrid soon to be transformative journals. What we need is for there to be the incentives for authors to take up those options, whether that comes in the form of making it really easy for authors to opt for open access. So for example, with transformative agreements where they don't need to worry about finding APC funding, and it's just a case of opting into open access publication, where that's also with the whole piece that we want to do with transformative journals in terms of educating authors about the benefits of open access. And obviously, in order to achieve that, we also need, as I was saying, to get those funding streams in place and to really have buy-in from research funders and from institutions to collaborate together in order to think about how we shift the funds that are currently being used either for subscriptions or that might be being used in the wild for APCs, in order to bring them together to successfully support authors in being able to make choices for open access. And I didn't really have time to go in detail in this in the short time that we had for the presentation, but I think one of the things that's really proved the success of that with the example of transformative agreements is what we see when we look at the increase that we have in open access uptake in some disciplines that might not traditionally be viewed as being very open access forward thinking or very engaged with open access. So with our UK transformative agreement with JISC, we released a white paper a couple of years ago where we looked at all of the different disciplines, and we saw huge increases in the humanities and the social sciences, where as soon as they had this support from their funders and the encouragement of their institutions to accept open access, and once the funding streams were all sorted out, we suddenly saw massive open access uptake amongst those authors. So it was a really positive picture.
Thanks, Jess. One of the other questions we've had, which slightly leads on from that point, you obviously mentioned within your presentation that Springer Nature now has 11 national TAs across the globe. One attendee has asked how hard it is to manage all those arrangements and what's the difference between them, because I would take it that it wouldn't be a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And actually, Frank, our CEO, did a blog post a few months ago about the complexities of transformative agreements, because as we see in the funding landscape, the policy landscape, and the needs of our partners in different countries can be quite different. And typically it can take 6 months to a year to negotiate and to work through together all of the different criteria that we need to be meeting for our partners, and also thinking about how that looks in terms of workflows for us. So it isn't necessarily all that easy to kind of get these off the ground, and that's why it is a process that takes us a number of years. But we continue to receive interest from partners, and obviously we've seen that portfolio of agreements really grow, and that's having a great impact in terms of making open access available to a much wider group of authors.
Fantastic, thank you. Moving slightly away from the transformative agreement questions and approach, another attendee has said, how is OA faring across the different subject areas? So are we seeing a difference in uptake, for example, between STEM and AHSS?
Yeah, also a really valid question there, and I think it is something where we're aware that interest in and engagement with open access is varied, but also the availability of funding for different authors. And in the AHSS, the arts, humanities and social sciences, I think one of the potential challenges for authors is that they might not have huge research grants that they can use to support open access publishing charges. And that's why it's really important that we do think about business models and ways of supporting open access that can enable open access for those authors, because that actually ties really nicely back into the point that I was just making in terms of our white paper on gold open access in the UK, where we looked at access uptake levels across the different disciplines, because before having those kinds of mechanisms in place to support really the open access uptake levels were a lot lower for disciplines like humanities and social sciences, and also for other areas that have a similar perhaps smaller research grant structure, so maths, for example. But although I think we're at a point where some disciplines may be a bit further ahead in terms of the level of familiarity with open access, I think it is positive that we see that when the conditions are right, authors are willing to take up open access options. So I think it's really about thinking how we can shift the burden so that it's not on authors to have to fight to be able to make their work open access, but that we're working with institutions, with funders to really enable that, because it is possible. It's just perhaps a little bit more challenging in some areas than others. And also, I suppose one point that I haven't really dug into a lot of detail, but it's really worth acknowledging, is the differences in publication types that are used across different subject areas. So for the arts, humanities and social sciences, monographs, books and chapters might be more typically used than in some other disciplinary areas. And we do have a flourishing open access books and chapters programme. As I mentioned, we've already hit 1,000 open access books, but obviously that is an area that's also a bit more in a kind of early growth stage than perhaps open access for journals and articles.
Great, thank you, Jess. Slightly leading on from a point you made earlier about the different policies and frameworks that structure OA, another question that we've had in is what roles all these national and international research assessment frameworks play in actually stimulating that debate around open science, and how is Springer Nature and other publishers, for that matter as well, preparing for changes on that front? Because obviously different regions are managed by different frameworks.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think we can see research funders and governments play a really big role in shifting attitudes and in shifting progress towards open access. In some countries and some regions, open access is starting to be built into the research assessment framework. So in the UK, for example, just to kind of focus where I'm most familiar, we have the Research Excellence Framework, the REF, and that builds in requirements for open access to outputs that are being assessed as part of the REF. And I think that's played a really important role in making sure that institutions and that researchers in the UK have an incentive to be thinking about open access as part of their process and to really get that on the agenda. And after that came in, we started to see, I think, a lot more dedicated focus on open access from institutions. But at Springer Nature, we work with partners, with funders and governments across the world who might have different focuses in terms of open access. And this is why we do see this as it's a transition, it's a process. So we hope we can demonstrate the benefits for those partners of open access. But it might be that they're having to move at slightly different speeds, depending on where funding frameworks are at the moment, to be able to support that transition of funds towards open access.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move slightly away now from the topic of policy. I know that's your hot topic, Jess, so see if we can get some other ones in. We have a couple of questions coming in around the actual kind of format of open access. One in particular asks a very valid question that I know we get asked quite a lot about preprints. So the attendee asks, in terms of transparency, wouldn't actually linking to preprints or freely shared author copies be more favourable instead of discouraging that?
I'm glad that someone's asked about that, because discouraging preprints is certainly not something that we would want to do. We're very supportive of sharing preprints. We've had preprint sharing policies for a number of years, but I think we realised last year that it wasn't perhaps necessarily clear enough the extent to which we really do encourage sharing of preprints. And so we released various blog posts and updates to our preprint policies to make it absolutely explicit that any authors who are submitting to Springer Nature journals are strongly encouraged to share the preprints, the submitted versions of their manuscripts openly and immediately, so with no restrictions. And we think that's a fantastic way of making sure that as research goes through the peer review process, there is early access to the ideas out there, and then once articles are accepted, we can have access then to the published version of record. And it's not, I think, an and or an or. I mean, sorry, it's not an either or an or, it's an and. We think that both of those parts are really important. So that's why although I didn't really talk in a huge amount of detail about this, that's why we have preprints on our little image of all the different open research outputs that we would want to encourage to link up. And this is also why we've been pioneering our in-review service for authors, where authors who are submitting to journals that support in-review, which over time should be all of the Springer Nature journals, are facilitated in immediately sharing their preprints by the in-review process. So that can then also be linked up to their published version if it's accepted for publication.
Great, thank you. I know we're nearly coming up to time, so I'll just take two more questions. Another attendee has asked about the actual concept of gold open access, and does within Gold OA actually consider the format of articles and citations? So, for example, a PDF versus HTML, plain text bibliographic references versus actual links, and publication by means, for example, a DOI. So would you be able to talk a bit more to that, please?
Yes, yeah, sure. So for a gold open access article, when we're talking about gold open access, it's really about the business model and the access. It doesn't change the inherent kind of processes that we go through as editors and publishers of journals in order to make the final published output as enhanced and as usable as possible. So in a journal that we have, a transformative journal, an article that was published via the gold open access route and an article that was published via the subscription route be exactly the same in terms of those core components of having a DOI, of having the HTML version, the PDF, all of the other kind of formatting and functionality would be the same. And what's different is that users who are coming to the website and accessing that gold open access version of record won't be kind of given any paywalls, won't be prevented from accessing this based on kind of subscription entitlements. Anyone who accesses that article can read and can make use of those different versions and that different functionality, which is why we think that Gold OA is really fantastic in terms of kind of that user experience, because it's bringing what has been the preserve of subscribers to an article to everyone in the world.
Great, thank you. So the last question that we have today, I think will probably be applicable to quite a few people on the call today. Obviously, a lot of what you've talked about, Jess, is how open science and open research is changing the way that we as publishers are working. And this particular question asks how comfortable Springer Nature is with these new business models that are coming in with open science and open research, and actually the impact that that has internally on how that has transformed a team structure.
That's an interesting question. I'd say Springer Nature, and we hope that the others share this view, is really wholeheartedly a proponent of open research. Obviously, my presentation has hopefully got that point across. So transforming our business and the way that we work with partners has been a key part of reaching our mission and of trying to make sure that the research outputs that we publish are as valuable as possible and are advancing discovery. So obviously that has meant some changes in the way that we work. So for open access, for example, we have to engage with authors in our business model a lot more, because rather than just working with institutions from a subscription perspective in terms of accessing journals, we're having to think about now authors are part of this process, potentially in terms of article processing charges. So that obviously involves things such as infrastructure around author payments and the communications to authors. But really, I think it's been a really great learning curve. We've been really lucky to work with great partners amongst institutions and funders who are at the forefront of driving open access. And so we continue to work with them, I think, to evolve these different business models. And it can be complicated, but also I think it is to everyone's benefit. So it's certainly not easy, and there certainly are still lots of challenges and things that we need to work out. But it's been, I think, really valuable for all of us involved to be able to kind of work together in that way and work it out.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jess. If there are no more questions, I think we're slowing down and we're nearly at time. So I think it's probably the right amount of time to say thank you so much for your time this afternoon, Jess. Thank you to all those that have attended our session this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are in the world. We hope that you've also found it valuable. And I suppose all that's left to say is enjoy the rest of Frankfurt, the virtual side of it this year. Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Bye.